I am very pleased to kick off the webinar today, and especially pleased to be co-hosting this event with the Stanford School of Medicine, specifically Circle at Stanford Psychiatry, which is a new research and action initiative focused on community-minded interventions for resilience, climate leadership, and emotional well-being. So today's webinar will be a conversation with Dr. Susan Bauer-Wu, along with Drs. Alyssa Epel and Britt Ray. Dr. Bauer-Wu is the author of the new book, A Future We Can Love, How We Can Reverse the Climate Crisis Through the Power of Our Hearts and Minds. She serves as the president of the Mind and Life Institute, an organization co-founded by the Dalai Lama to bring science and contemplative wisdom together to better understand the mind, foster dialogue, and create positive change in the world. Dr. Bauer-Wu has also published an earlier book, Leaves Falling Gently, Living Fully with Serious and Life-Limiting Illness Through Mindfulness, Compassion and Connectedness. And previously, she was an oncology, psychiatric, and hospice nurse, and completed PhD studies in psychoneuroimmunology and postdoctoral training in behavioral medicine. Dr. Britt Ray is the director of Circle at Stanford Psychiatry and the author of Generation Dread. And our very own Alyssa Epel is professor and vice chair in the Department of Psychiatry here at UCSF and co-chair of the Center for Climate Health and Equity's Mental Health Task Force. She is also the author of The Stress Prescription and co-author of The Telomere Effect. Now, before I turn it over to Dr. Bauer-Wu, who will share insights from her book for a few minutes, before we have a conversation about finding hope and mental health, I wanted to let the audience know that we are recording the webinar and there will be an opportunity for Q&A at the end. Please submit your questions to the Q&A function on Zoom. I'll be monitoring it. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Susan.
Thanks so much, Ariane. It's really a delight to be here with all of you, and many thanks to my colleagues at the University of California and also at Stanford. It's just really, really wonderful for me to be with my friends Alyssa and Britt, who are co-travelers on our climate journey. We all care very much about this topic, and we hope that this conversation, this hour together, will be just the beginning of ongoing conversations for all of you across the systems and everybody who's watching. It's a beautiful day here. I'm in Charlottesville, Virginia, and it's a gorgeous autumn day. And you would never know that it is a climate emergency that we're facing all over the world, and we are. And so even on the beautiful days, it's even more important for us to continue these conversations and to remember that how we show up and being in this together is vitally important. So the book, A Future We Can Love, the subtitle of it is that it was also inspired by a conversation between the Dalai Lama and Greta Thunberg, and it was a conversation that took place in January of 2021. And it was January 9th, I believe it was. It was a few days after all the violence in Washington, D.C., and we had more than about 1 million people who joined live on that day and for that event. And while we know the Dalai Lama cares greatly about the environment and all our only home, this wonderful earth that we share, and Greta is an amazing activist and mobilizer of young activists all over the world, why would so many people join us live for that event? And I think it was because both the Dalai Lama and Greta are beacons of hope and are people who are from different generations and different parts of the world and different cultures. And if they can come together and talk about this problem, really the biggest problem that humanity has ever faced, if they could come together, then we should be coming together too. And my sense is that, at least from my own story and my own experience of going through my climate journey, is that the more that I have felt connected with other people, the more buoyed my heart and my spirit have felt, which has really kept me going. And I hope that you all will be feeling the same way through this conversation. So I want to mention that Mind and Life, the Mind and Life Institute, has been engaged in work as it relates to human-earth connection for a few years now. And we used to talk about human flourishing. And I think at this point in time, we're looking at flourishing and flourishing for all, because we as a human species won't flourish if our planet and all the living beings on our planet aren't flourishing either. One other thing I'll mention about the inspiration for the book and for the event is the launch of free films called Climate Emergency Feedback Loops Films. You could find that on feedbackloopsclimate.com. And really, really excellent free films that lay out the science of climate feedback loops. And they're available in over 30 languages, 30 subtitled languages. So, and they have a curriculum guide that you can share in the classroom for all ages, from junior high, high school, and higher education. So, with that opening, I'll also just say, we have a very short period of time that we're going to be together, and I'm grateful that I have a few minutes to share some reflections that particularly relate to the emotional, psychological, and spiritual challenges of what the climate catastrophe calls us to address, and how we can rise to the occasion. So I'll share a few of my thoughts that are outlined in the book, and even some excerpts from the book. And then really excited that we can have a conversation with Britt and Alyssa and all of you as well. So we talk about climate feedback loops, which are the physical sciences of what is happening with the climate catastrophe. But I want to talk a bit about human feedback loops. And there are Buddhist principles that I think there is great wisdom that we can all learn from. And these Buddhist principles often are referred to as the three poisons, or as I describe or like to label as the human feedback loops, which are delusion, greed, and aversion. So the first one about delusion, and delusion is essentially that we don't quite get it. We don't quite get it, how interconnected we really are. So I'll share with you a little Buddhist story. It's a teaching, and it's called the Avatam Satka Sutra, or the Flower Garden Sutra, often referred to as Indra's net. And goes something like this: that there was this great god called Indra who had a heavenly abode, and it was a wonderful net, and it was glittering. And in each eye of the net was a jewel. And the net was infinite, going on and on and on. And if you looked at each eye, you'd see a jewel. And if you look closely at any of the jewels, you'd see reflections of all the other jewels. And each of the other jewels were reflected in that one jewel. And so it's this infinite reflecting. Indra's net is a teaching of interdependence, and the fact that everything, every one of us is interconnected. We are all in it together, and we're depending on each other. I'll read a little bit from the book about interdependence. And that interdependence means, of course, our actions have consequences. And of course, the more of us there are to act on this planet, a number that has grown exponentially in the past decades and centuries, that is now 8 billion people, the more and greater consequences we will have. Interdependence means we're not separate from nature, and we're not separate from each other, and any civilization that runs against the reality of interdependence is delusional. And well, no wonder it can't hold up. Denying and disrespecting our interdependence, no wonder we've created, on the one hand, societies of people who can't get enough, and on the other hand, people who truly don't have enough. No wonder the Arctic is melting, land is flooding, species are dying, and the earth is burning. Interdependence means, of course, we cannot carry on with business as usual and not expect to be affected by the consequences of our own actions and by the actions of every other jewel in the universe in response. And His Holiness the Dalai Lama says, quote, ignorance of interdependence has not only harmed the natural environment, but human society as well. Instead of caring for one another, we place most of our efforts for happiness in pursuing individual material consumption. We have become so engrossed in the pursuit that, without knowing it, we have neglected to foster the most basic human needs of love, kindness, and compassion. This is very sad. So the second human feedback loop, or the second poison I want to lift up, it relates to desire or craving. And I'd like to share something that Buddhist scholar David Loy says as it relates to craving. David says, because the separate self isn't true, it's fundamentally insecure. And we experience this sense of lack, which we try to fill with money or fame or sex or power or potato chips, on the misguided assumption that the thing we lack is out there. David makes the connection between this inner sense of lack and a collective sense of lack, owing to our collective sense of separation from the natural world, a societal delusion. And we try to fill this collective sense of lack with economic and technological growth. Individually and collectively, then, we find ourselves caught in feedback loops of craving. Why, David asks, is more better if it will never be enough? So that's the craving loop. And then the third loop I want to just point to relates to aversion, is what the Buddhists call, or what we could just simply call the disliking or fearing loop. And essentially with the disliking and the fearing loop, it's that we dislike the idea of changing our lives. We think we have to give up so much. We have to sacrifice the good life that we're living in order to have a less than fulfilling life. And I think that that actually is really an illusion. And so we dislike, and we put our hands, we have this resistance toward making any changes because it's too uncomfortable and it's too unsettling to do that. And then the idea of fearing and the fearing loop is that we're afraid what's going to happen if we look clearly at what is happening. And what I ask you to consider is that to lean into the fear and to metabolize the fear through looking at it as it is, and to do it in the context and in the presence of others, because the more that we can do it together, the less fearful and afraid we are. And by metabolizing our fear, actually, it mobilizes us to show up in the ways that we need to do that and to speak up in the ways that we need to. The third section of the book is I talk about two different kinds of emotional experiences that I think are two sides of the same coin. And one is heartbreak, and the other is wonderment. And heartbreak is real. We should feel heartbreak because climate awareness is about caring. And caring is really our most fundamental, deepest impulse as human beings, is to care. And so because we care, because we see the loss of species that's happening around us, and the climate refugees that are having to move their homes, particularly in the global south, there's heartbreak there. We should feel sadness. We should feel heartbreak. And so that is absolutely part of the truth. But the other part of the truth is that there's also beauty and wonder and love that is also present and is also possible. And I'll share with you something. There's an author named Jenny Odell, and she wrote a book of how to do nothing. And Jenny walks around her neighborhood with a jeweler's loupe in order to look at things magnified 10 times. And so she's already a dedicated bird watcher and flora appreciator. And she says it's a simple and inexpensive gadget. So you could all ask your friends and family for a holiday gift. You can get a jeweler's loupe. But essentially, this gadget has opened up her eyes to the everyday world around her in new and amazing ways. She says, you have to get really close to something with the loupe. And then all of a sudden it pops into focus, and it's like the plant that you thought was smooth, it's really hairy or something, you know? So receiving the pocket-sized high-powered magnifying glass as a gift from a thoughtful friend who noticed how much you like this, she thought, quote, I'll never be bored again, which is what has been said about the smartphone. But Jenny says the difference is that it fills her with wonder instead of dread. So the wonder is available to us all the time. We just have to stop and to look closely. Another topic I just want to briefly touch on is something called quantum social change, or this quantum universal interconnectedness that climate researcher, behavioral scientist Karen O'Brien at the University of Oslo, she has written about in her book. Her book is that you matter more than you think. And to me, this idea of quantum social change really gives me hope that each one of us can make a difference. I'm going to share a little bit from my book on what Karen has to say. So in search of a more holistic approach, Karen has developed a theory of what she calls quantum social change, where personal and collective transformation, inner beliefs and outer actions, individual and societal structures, bottom-up and top-down approaches, I and we, are interdependent and simultaneous, not opposite or separate spheres. Karen says fractals are a better metaphor for scaling social change. She says, we see them in nature, we can create them in algebra and geometry. The difference is that social fractals, cultural fractals, and human fractals, they all embed values. And these values, when they guide our action, resonate and replicate across all scales. Values like courage, generosity, transparency, humility, humor, and empathy. The point is that who we are and how we show up every day, every moment, each moment, here and now, to everything, matters. If you think about yourself as a quantum fractal of change that is entangled through language, through meaning, through consciousness, through a shared context, which we are all inhabiting on this planet, then you can see that you actually can influence your family and your friends, your personal network, your community, all the way up to the global level. In short, Karen says, you matter more than you think. And finally, I want to share, just lift up the beautiful wisdom of Joanna Macy. Joanna is a pioneer environmental activist and Buddhist wisdom keeper, and strong, vibrant, beautiful woman, even now at age 94. And Joanna reminds us, and I'm paraphrasing her here, that uncertainty is not knowing. And not knowing opens the space for possibility. And everything is possible. Everything is possible when we don't know. And it helps to think about that. For me, I want my grandsons and all the young people in my family and around the world to have that sense of possibility. And at the same time, know that, like unadorned fingers, they are enough as they are in this moment, beautiful, whole, and enough right now. And we are all part of an interconnected web with an infinite ripples of possibility. So thank you for listening to these few reflections, and I turn it over to Brett.
Thank you so much, Susan, for laying all of that out to us as we can then collectively dive into your beautiful book, Future We Can Love, whether we've actually held it in our hands or not so far. It is highly readable. It's really accessible. Seriously, congratulate you on being able to integrate all of the science to raise our awareness, all of the spiritual teachings to touch our inner dimensions. For those on the call, we know, of course, Greta Thunberg and His Holiness the Dalai Lama are hugely influential figures. And for Susan to have both of them in her sphere, influencing this work and how it came out is very impressive. But there are more illustrious people that make Susan really the right person to be writing this book and offering it to our society at this time. One that made me stop in my tracks is that you personally, through car rides with Donella Meadows, learned about sustainability for the first time. Donella Meadows is an incredibly impactful complex systems theorist who has really changed the game for how we can understand these complex interconnected systems in which we live and push on leverage points, as she calls them, to be able to help bring about positive tipping points and not only the negative ones that are so scary to grapple with. And that's a bit like having private lessons in physics from Einstein in terms of how amazing that relationship is to be able to read about in the book. So I appreciated those kinds of things. One thing that really struck me as I was reading was how this book advocates for youth in a way that youth want to be advocated for as climate leaders in the world today. Far too often are they held up as the solution to the climate crisis, so to speak, because they've had the ferocity, the passion, the pain and distress pushing them to take a stand, to strike from school, to collect in the millions in cities around the world, which has made often intergenerationally this conversation look like, oh, they will be the ones to fix this. You know, look at their bravery. They're the ones who give me hope. When instead, what they want is to be stood with. We see this opening in the conversation between the Dalai Lama and Greta when she thanks him for the way that he has been standing for them and for future generations through his environmental advocacy for years, and doesn't approach her as a solution, but rather as just one more voice through which the pain of Mother Earth is speaking and calling us into right action. And there's a lot to be said about what intergenerational solidarity needs to look like, which includes not only upholding the brilliance of the youth voice and its natural visionariness. I'll come back to this idea of being visionary in just a second, but also to name the pain and why it's appropriate and where it's coming from. You discuss many valences of moral distress, moral injury, moral outrage, and why being a young person today and witnessing the power holders are not upholding their end of the deal as a young person is a true deep yes, force that creates this perpetuation of climate anxiety that we see around us today. It's not just that the environment isn't doing well, so to speak, and that is the engine of this distress. It's really about the breakdown in social relationships that one should be able to have trust in from a moral standpoint. And you write about this interesting dynamic between visionary action and cynicism, the culture of cynicism that predominantly in the West we see today. And so action without a vision of what we're building is somewhat useless, right? Because we can get caught in a rut of only taking action from a destructive place, from wanting to break down structures and systems that are harming people in the more than human world. And that's understandable, but we also need to have a shared platform and a design architecture that inspires us, that gets us to all march under the same banner so that we can understand what it is that we're constructing and building in these quantum times, as you say. It's a time of dying and a time of birthing. And so what is it that we're birthing as we're going through this hospicing of modernity, as is sometimes referred to, particularly by Vanessa Andreotti and others in the work of gesturing towards decolonial futures, which I think is a beautiful companion to your work here. And so to be visionary, what does that mean? It means that we need to be earnest. We need to be sincere about what is right and wrong. We need to be able to stand up as young people naturally do in close connection to the earth with a solid stance of interconnection, interdependence, interbeing, feeling the pain of what is being inflicted upon our relations, on the ecosystems upon which we depend, and then not yet bruised, as many of us as we get older are, from the world, from what it inflicts upon us, from how we understand injustice and witness it perpetually, from how our experiences can make us jaded and then unfortunately cynical. And you write that afraid of disappointment or ridicule, we aim low for what we think we can get instead of what we really want and truly want. Then, when we meet these hobbled goals, cynicism assumes that it was all just an accident as to why we achieved those things. Whereas when we fall short, cynicism then takes it as an omen, like see, I knew I'd fail, of course. Uh, whereas thinking that we can get even less from that place of cynicism perpetuates us to go for even less, on and on. So this is the engine of learned helplessness, if you will, which we really need to move beyond in order to raise our sense of, yes, personal efficacy, but more importantly, collective efficacy. And this is a huge theme throughout the book. You're not talking about agency and isolation. You're talking about these dynamics, which really affect us differently across age spectrums if we're not conscious and careful and nourishing ourselves with deeper spiritual practices to keep that visionary element alive and stave off this enemy of being visionary for our actions, which is the culture of cynicism that we often find ourselves in. So it is, however, easy to feel cynical as a defense when we're faced with so much uncertainty, right? And here, I just wanted to touch on how the book really unpacks that we are forced to confront with so much uncertainty in the climate crisis about how bad this is all going to get. You spend a lot of time discussing climate tipping points, explaining what they are and how we might be surpassing some of them already. Uncertainty about when nations will respond meaningfully and so on. And with the stakes being this high, I can easily feel like we're walking off a plank into unknown waters, which understandably is a scary feeling to say the least. So with this, I'd like to invite Alyssa Epple on screen, just because you have some wonderful tools from Alyssa at the end of the book. You have this fabulous compendium of actions that we can all take that might speak more to some of us than others based on our personality, our natural predilections, our abilities, and the things that bring us joy. So it's a real offering, that last chunk of the book, to look for things that energize us. And Alyssa has included there stress, resilience, and hope in the Anthropocene, 3 tips for mental preparedness, which are to 1, pack lightly, 2, welcome uncertainty, and 3, build hope with absolute and active forms of hope. So Alyssa, could you tell us what those really are?
Absolutely. Thank you, Britt. I was well, first of all, I'm just delighted in this moment to bring together your work and the Stanford Initiative on Climate Distress to our center, and to introduce Susan to all of us in our community, and how she has integrated and brought together so many voices in this book. So I also loved the book, and your comments, Britt. There's so many layers and layers of both aha moments, naming how the complexity of how we're feeling and how that changes throughout this journey we're on together in this crisis, and how we hold on to hope, how we can metabolize grief and despair. So I was just absolutely blown away by the wisdom in the book. And then I got to the end, and there was some things that I had suggested. So that was a surprise in the very back. And I was delighted to see that. I thought, does this fit in? And it actually does. So I will tell you why those three things are important to me. To pack lightly, both physically and metaphorically, to welcome uncertainty, and to build absolute and active hope. And they actually fit into the human feedback loops that Susan mentioned. So I am here in Northern California. Many of you also sit here where we are on unceded territory, unceded land of the Ohlone and other indigenous people, and we haven't known how to tend to the earth. And we have had since 2020 the largest wildfires in this area that have ravaged both ancient forests, killed human lives, especially wildlife. And we know that we are just in for much more, that we are going to see cycles and cycles of smoke, wildfire, heat waves, drought. And so I have had my share of climate distress. When we went through the first cycles in 2020, being an optimist, had no emergency preparedness, not an ounce of it in my house, no emergency supplies, no water, no food, no go bag. So after a few cycles, I got with it and did what everyone else was doing here, and was prepared for the unknown and the uncertain future and the next disaster. And it relieved so much anxiety to finally have a go bag, and know what a go bag is, and to realize how many people on this earth need to have a go bag now. So that's the physical go bag, and that's the small material things we can do for preparedness for those around us, for our human body. Then there is the go bag for our mental preparedness. And so the same rules apply. What is it that you truly need in life? What should you be spending your limited attention and time on? And so as a aging researcher, we sometimes ask ourselves this: how do you want to spend the rest of your life? Doing an inventory, whatever age you are, realizing how precious time is, how little time you have, and really following your values here for how you spend your time. So I suggest that people make a short list on both materially you can make your go bag, but spiritually, to focus on really prioritizing your time. So how do you lighten your mind? How do you focus your attention each day on what matters to you, and letting the rest go? We spend so much mental real estate, so much time on things we can't change. Now, this fits into the craving loop. So does anyone feel too busy in terms of your mental, having a light mental go bag as you go through life? What are you carrying? Does anyone feel more stressed out than you need to be? Of course we do, because it's the craving loop. We do too much. We rush too much. We think that our worthiness depends on our achievements and our time use. And so it's that we need moving from the craving and clinging mindset to the abundant mindset that we have enough. Now, the other piece of that is when we're rushing, we really can't think well, do well, be our best self. And so the wisdom, the creativity, the joy, these have to have spaciousness and have to allow us to use our mindfulness to be connecting to other people and to what matters most. So again, pack pack lightly every day, set your attention each morning. Okay, so that is the go bag. Then number 2 is welcome uncertainty. And you've both talked about that so beautifully. So the only certainty we have, of course, is the uncertain future. And so it's exhausting to be in the fear loop, to be worrying about what's next, trying to control outcomes. And so one way we can think of this mindset, this lighter mindset for welcoming uncertainty, is to actually release that control that we're trying to exert of the future. We can't control outcomes, but of course we can control what we do now to tend the fertile ground for maximizing positive outcomes. And so there's a dialectic between both releasing our fear of the future so that we can actually be in the luxury of the present, of what we do have, of what is here now. So what makes us miserable is, of course, working for things that wanting things we don't have. And so this idea of the exhaustion that comes with caring about climate, being a climate activist, can be relieved through switching our engine from the capitalist engine that's burning, the oil of how we use our time and commercialize it and need more, to regenerative energy, the regenerative energy of working on what matters most to us, and whatever that is in the climate world is different for all of us, and working together, as you both have said so well, that there's no, the Western linear mindset of the illusion of feeling alone leaves us feeling hopeless, leaves us feeling helpless. We can't do anything alone. So it really is this working together. So controlling what we do have control over, which is now in our local environment. And then lastly, building hope. So I love how Jane Goodall says hope is a survival skill. And it is so easy for hope to wax and wane based on news. And so I like the idea of absolute hope, which is not dependent on what the latest news or statistics are, but rather more of a robust, absolute sense of we will keep doing everything we can because there is no other option. And so expecting to gain, to lose and regain the flimsy hope while holding on to this more robust hope that we can all hold on to through the shared vision, through this idea of a regenerative future, working on regenerative fuel together. So I love, Susan, your this vision of us as these social fractals of change. So I'll just end with that is how we can maintain hope, is holding that both metaphor and true complex systems model of how we change, quantum social change, through this ability to see and hold on to the model and really work together. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alyssa. I love the gritty, robust hope that you offer, and how many different ways there are thinking about this today. Some call it stubborn optimism, like Christiana Figueres and other architects of the Paris Agreement. And in order to dig a little bit deeper into this book, Susan, I just want to briefly go to your previous book, because you actually wrote a book based on your clinical experiences as a nurse helping cancer patients, people with terminal illness diagnoses. And you write that really showed you how we humans often come most alive when we touch the raw nerve of our death awareness, when we confront our mortality in a very visceral, personally existential way. And this connects with the Buddhist teaching of impermanence. So would you be able to just clarify that link a little bit for us, please? And also your thinking on how the idea that the ecosystems upon which we depend, the sense that we have now, which brings our climate grief, that they have received a terrible diagnosis, might actually be a beautiful thing for us.
Thanks, Britt. Yeah, it's seeing clearly to the realities of impermanence and seeing things dying before our eyes. I mean, right now I'm actually looking out the window and it's autumn. We have these reminders in nature all the time that there's death and there's beauty in death. And there's oftentimes regeneration that happens, but not always, right? Because when species die, they die. And you know, in my years of working in clinical practice, I just saw it time and time and time again. I even experienced it through some of my own personal journey with loved ones, is that, you know, we take things for granted. We just have it. I think it's this coping mechanism that we have of having control. Alyssa, you talked a bit about this, but I think it's part of our mental illusion that we try to have control and think that things are going to be stable, and that just makes us feel better, right? Momentarily, it makes us feel better. And the moment that we can sort of have this this wake up call, that's what a lot of cancer patients call it. It's a wake up call that you realize that this life is precious. It really is precious. It always was. We're all dying, right? The moment we're born, we begin to die, but we think that we're not. But the great gift, the great silver lining in dealing with grief and loss is this realization that actually this is precious. And in the moment we begin to realize how precious it is, we see the beauty. We see beauty, we feel it. Moments stop. Time becomes irrelevant. There's this beautiful spaciousness that becomes possible when we can really, really drop into being fully present with the truth of loss and of blessings. They both happen. And I think that what we're facing in humanity with the climate crisis and the loss of species and the loss of human life all the time is much like a serious life-threatening diagnosis. It is a life-threatening diagnosis. It is. It is. And we can deny it. We can turn the other way. We can make like it's not happening. That is one way to cope with it. Or we could actually realize it, and when we begin to realize it, we actually can feel a little bit more whole and a little bit more buoyed by the beauty and love that's right there for us.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you for unpacking that. I'm going to wade into some waters that are sometimes a bit choppy, and it would be great to get both Alyssa and Susan your thoughts on this, because I'm still trying to figure out how I think about this. The book does lay out that interdependence as a Buddhist teaching offers to us the realization that it would be a mistake to take on some kind of victim perpetrator complex in the climate crisis, where we, for instance, maybe repeat the common activist refrain that this is all the fault of fossil fuel executives and their lobbyists and PR and marketing people who for many decades have, of course, been engaging in corporate malfeasance and lying and greenwashing and purposefully stalling climate action for profit, which is, you know, racking up now in a lot of negative externalities that are basically committing crimes against our bodies. And so that there's some serious offense, and we now have the new wave of climate litigation and trying to correct some of these wrongs in courts and so on. But to have a victim perpetrator complex where it's all the boogeyman's bad fault and not ours, has some real issues in it when we lean into the Dharma and teachings of interdependence and interbeing. And I'm wondering if you could just explain a little bit more about why this would be a mistake based on interdependence to look at the climate crisis that way, and maybe even try to resolve it that way in terms of outlining responsibility and blame and making people pay and so on. And what we might do instead, or how we could have a raising of consciousness collectively to go about this in a way that doesn't just automatically raise people's defenses if they're being told that they're basically evil.
Just a simple little issue there, Britt. I really appreciate you lifting it up because it's real and it's on our minds all the time, and it comes up all the time. I don't have any magic answers. I'll share a few thoughts, but definitely want to hear what Alyssa and you have to say on this topic. I think that the victim perpetrator mentality relates to something that you mentioned in your opening reflections, Britt. It's kind of this collective learned helplessness in a way, where it's just that's not going to get us anywhere. It really is a cynical mindset, and doesn't offer us any possibility for hope. Yes, there is absolute truth that the big companies, the fossil fuel companies, the other multinational companies that are 100% about huge profit margins are a huge part of the problem. Yes, 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 yes. And also, we and many billions of us purchase products and live lives that contribute to depending on the products that they make. So we are part of it. If people weren't buying things and if there wasn't a need, there wouldn't be the profit margins. So, I remember that car ride with Donella Meadows in the 90s. She it might have even been the 80s. I think it was the late 80s. She even, she said I had a V6 car. And I was like, it's a comfortable car. And it's a really, it thought it would be, I didn't realize anything was wrong with it. And she said, well, do you really need such a big, fast car? And I'd never thought about it before. It's just a simple question. So each of us is part of this web that's fueling the really big systems. We are part of it. The other thing, if you ask all the climate science, and I've talked to a lot of climate scientists, many of them are in agreement that one of the most important things we could do, it's not only what we buy and how we travel, but voting. If we live in a democracy and we can vote, and we're looking at local voting, state voting, national voting, regional voting, it matters. And then we have to be voting for ecologically minded, conscious leaders, and then hold them accountable to their promises. And we can do that. Like, we have power to influence that. And then that leads to who's in power influences policies, and whether or not there's carbon taxes. That ultimately will trickle down to the companies. So it absolutely is this multidimensional, complex system that we are part of, and we're part of the problem, and we're part of the solutions.
Great. Thank you.
I want to hear Britt's answer to this one. That was a beautiful answer, Susan. I agree with all of it. I just want to say we're not, we don't get off the hook with our personal carbon footprint, but that is not where the answer is. And so there has been, so many millions spent on misinformation continuing now. There's so much of the fossil fuel industry's efforts really have tricked us to focusing on our own, blaming ourselves, the guilt, and it's about recycling. And so it's not that we still need to change what we can in our homes and our behaviors, but we have to be focusing on what is our most high impact actions that we can do in our local world, things we can touch, things we can influence. And as you said, it is policy, it is voting, it is advocacy, it's affecting institutions and policy at every level. So that is what we can only do together. And so I think that the realization that we can't ignore the systems, and yes, we are part of the systems, but really we could so easily spend all our energy on the small things that won't add up to make a difference if we don't really start to push on the the powerful nodes of the system, which is the industry and the policies. Britt, your turn.
Oh, those are great answers. It's difficult. I think that we have a problem with language. I think that what's needed is a discussion about emotional maturity at scale, how we can create emotionally mature institutions, how we can have a spiritual leveling up across platforms of power so that we can truly shift from generations of power holders who have been taught to think about optimizing for economic health, shifting to a paradigm where we are walking with youth leaders who are thinking only about optimizing for planetary health, right? And how do we do that? There's a truth and reconciliation process that we need to have. Much like we've seen in apartheid states, much like we've seen with the genocide of indigenous peoples across Turtle Island, which we are not having enough of a conversation around still, in terms of really what has been done knowingly, historically, by people with power and money in the fossil fuel industry and their propaganda machines, right? I mean, it's been dug up by science historians, by investigative journalists. We have the evidence, we have the internal memos from the late 70s and 80s, what they were saying about knowing that the corporate planning scenario would make a truly catastrophic situation for a large fraction of humanity, and that their own internal climate modeling groups are very much accurate and on track with where we're at now, and they knew where it was going to be going. So, and then, instead invested in confusing the public and sowing doubt and so on and so forth, planting fake experts, cherry picking data, the story. So it's like, we need to deal with that, but we also need to do it in a way that doesn't shame and villainize people when they didn't wake up every day and think, hey, I want to burn the planet for money. They thought they were on the right side of history, surely, and providing for their children and families and what have you. And so how can it be about bringing in an opportunity for taking responsibility in a way that is spiritually fulfilling, in a way that is about deeper interconnection, and that brings meaning to one's life. It's hard to imagine, because, imagine bringing this to the UN climate negotiations or some climate litigation suit. Like, we have very different codified ways of talking about this, and the language of economics and the language of spirituality are not easy, friends, but I think we need to make them more so. I think we need radical transdisciplinarity in the ways that we have these conversations going forth, and global witnessing to the trauma, and really being there for it and not denying it, touching it, as you said earlier, Susan, like leaning into it. I think we have to do that on an institutional level. So I think it somehow connects. But Raphael, one of our audience members, has a question. Raphael says, I love your points about individual agency, but I also can't help but wonder, how do we reconcile filling material needs, especially in places like NorCal, where the cost of living is so high, with the way we want to spend our time instead of running after a paycheck? What is enough action, and how do you get out of the shame and guilt cycle? I suppose that could be to anyone.
Lisa, how about you answer that one?
Boy, I was looking at you two, really dying to hear your answer. Raphael, we all empathize with you. This is, it feels like the feeling is that we're a bit trapped in the everyday demands and rush. And when we were having the fires, for example, and I was saying, we've got to change how we're thinking about each day and not just go on with business as usual. That, how do we do that together in the ways that we can in our current local environments, families, schools, workplaces? We can't wait for a big transformation or an apocalypse. We realize that so many people feel trapped in the current, including materialistic and time demands of the day. So I feel trapped. I want to hear what you two say about that. I think it's wonderful, people who work in climate. I know there's tremendous challenges, but when your full-time job is in something that, gives you so much purpose, it's beautiful. And I'm trying to make that transition. And Britt and I, and, Susan's been helping. We're working on a class for undergraduates to help them with their climate resilience mindset and climate action. And so that they don't feel trapped in the same way that many of us do.
I think, you know, not everybody has the same opportunities for time to act, to be part of it. Everybody's different, and some people have very, very limited opportunities and don't have the privilege to even think about this. I think it's just really important to note that. But if you have time to join the call and you're thinking about it, and you have the privilege to make changes in your life, you begin to just notice. We make micro decisions, countless micro decisions every day, every day, and those decisions, many of them, if not all of them, have some ripple down effect related to climate. So I just encourage you to think about within your sphere of influence what you can do, in those small decisions every day. And for us to recognize that not everybody has the privilege to do that, and to help those who can't.
Thank you all very much. This was a very important and moving talk, much appreciated. And I just want to build on what Susan just said. In the culture that I come from, there is a saying that is said that with every raindrop, the bucket fills. And I think as we think about everybody's individual agency, it fits into that same sort of bucket filling type of motto. So with that, I'd love this talk. Thank you so much to our three speakers for your time today, and to the Stanford Climate Change and Mental Health Special Initiative of the Chair of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences for co-hosting today. And of course, thank you all for attending. This webinar is recorded and it will be available to attendees soon. Thanks all.